Bed sharing with infants has become a very controversial concept over recent years due to its safety concerns. With many families participating in this sleeping method, it's possible that it is increasing their risk of SIDS even though it may be beneficial in other aspects. We'll take a look at the evidence, pros and cons, and safety concerns behind the co-sleeping preference. A study conducted by Rashmir Rajan Das, Jiva Sankar, Ramesh Argwal, and Vinod Kumar Paul asked if bed sharing was beneficial and safe during infancy. In this article, 21 cases were examined using cohort case-controlled observational studies to analyze the possible outcomes of bed sharing during infancy. Bed sharing has been said to help mothers with breastfeeding and protect infants against hypothermia due to the proximity of the parents. The worry of bed sharing developed when it was identified as a risk factor of sudden infant death syndrome, where an infant would pass away during their sleep. There was a time period where babies were separated from their mothers after birth in order to keep them from possible infectious diseases. The severity of the effects were acknowledged when they found that there were serious emotional and psychological developmental problems between mother and child. It was later on that sleeping with your infant was highly recommended by the World Health Organization as a part of the Baby-Friendly Hospital Initiative in order to promote the best health for a mother and her child. Bed sharing became controversial when the public health departments felt that it contributed to SIDS, but with little evidence, there was only concrete proof that SIDS was increased with mothers who smoked, used drugs, or drank alcohol. They stated that cultures with normal practices of bed sharing with higher risks of SIDS was in response to other factors, such as alcohol, smoking, and drugs. Infants in the first 4 weeks of life in this experiment were followed and then evaluated occasionally for a period of time after. These studies were looked at from multiple developed countries and the results were as followed. Breastfeeding rates were higher at 75.5% versus 50%. But the SIDS risk was higher at 23.3% versus 11.2%. The conclusion they came to stated that breastfeeding is associated with higher breastfeeding rates at 4 weeks and an increased rate of SIDS, but there are not enough studies that investigate the official hazardous circumstances of bed sharing, so the overall evidence of bed sharing is low. An additional article investigating the same concept, done by Tanya Horsley, Tammy Clifford, and Nicholas Barrowman, discussed the benefits and harms associated with the practice of bed sharing. 40 observational cases were studied and consistently suggested that the risk of SIDS was higher with smokers when bed sharing with infants. The data showed that bed sharing with infants was strongly associated to higher rates in SIDS. The existing data does not provide an association to SIDS in non-smokers. Studies recognized women who prolonged breastfeeding preferred sharing a bed with their infant, providing a positive affiliation when associating breastfeeding and sleeping with an infant. Characteristics of the studies, including design, population, and risk factors, were tabulated. Quantitative estimates of the association between bed sharing and harms were extracted by a statistic using a standardized extraction form. Adjusted odd ratios were chosen in preference to unadjusted odd ratios because of concerns about confounding within case-controlled studies. The investigations focused on the 3 child-related benefits of bed sharing: breastfeeding, parent-child bonding, and sleep-related issues. Searchers came across 3 studies that observed the correlation between bed sharing and breastfeeding. This observation was conducted in England, the United States, and New Zealand, and reported on various follow-up intervals including 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 18 years. The ethnicities of the study population were similar, with white subjects being studied mainly, while one study included Black, non-Hispanic, Hispanic, and Asian participants. Overall, it suggested that there is a positive association between bed sharing and an increased duration of breastfeeding. The data cannot clarify the issue of death occurring in infants. Whether bed sharing promotes breastfeeding or breastfeeding promotes bed sharing, women who are most likely to practice prolonged breastfeeding tend to bed share. Between 1996 and 2004, 3 of the studies showed infant sleep-wake patterns. The U.S. and New Zealand were studied due to the represented populations with differing socioeconomic status. Studies showed that infants who bed-shared had an increased number of awakenings when compared with solitary sleeping infants. Although 2 studies show that infants who bed-shared had awakenings much shorter than that of a child who was a solitary sleeper. Evidence suggests that there may be a heavy association between bed-sharing and SIDS among smokers. This doesn't mean that no association between bed-sharing and SIDS exists among non-smokers, but existing evidence does not establish an association. This suggests that co-sleeping and SIDS strongly affects more children in infancy than anything. Studies show that there is evidence that propose a positive association between the increased rate and duration of breastfeeding and bed-sharing. Evidence suggests that infants who bed-share have an increased number of disturbances and awakenings during the nighttime when they compare to solitary sleeping children. Bed-sharing is on the rise and becoming a common practice in society. Sharing a bed with your infant is a topic of major controversy, so healthcare professionals are regularly discussing the risks. The most that people can do is possibly leave their infant in the crib or in the same room as their parents, or at least make sure to look at all the possible risks that comes with bed sharing and take the proper precautions that come with it.
Hi guys, I'm here with Jessica, the Kava Cat. My name is Eva. I'm going to be asking her a few questions about whether or not she agrees with the topic of whether mothers and parents should be sleeping with their infant at night. And I'm going to start with the first question. Sure. So, first question, what is your stance on co-sleeping between mother and infant?
I think depending upon the age and of the child, I think it kind of depends. For me personally, I love to sleep with my son, and he's 5 years old. But when he was younger, I put him in the crib. He slept mostly in the crib or at my side in a separate locker, just because I felt like, kind of like that's the thing to do.
Right.
And usually you do stuff like that, depending upon your culture though too. I think it's very culturally diverse. And stuff like that, but me personally, I would have to say that I would, I kept him in the crib, and I feel like he was would be safer there than sleeping with me, because I might roll over in the middle of the night or something like that. If you're not sleeping, if you're having maybe a nightmare or you're not having a good night's sleep, you could kind of move around and maybe you might get hurt. So,
Right, exactly. Yeah, you really can't control that.
yeah, that's true.
Okay. Second question. Is that like saying from are you saying that kind of from your own personal experience in a way?
Well, for instance, for one instance, for circumstance, actually, when Mason was 3 months old, I actually had left him on the bed for a few moments while I was actually just right there putting away the laundry, and he had rolled off the bed. So, kind of just given different circumstances, not necessarily that same circumstance, but if we're asleep, it would kind of be the same thing as if maybe they were alone, because you're not necessarily watching over them while you're sleeping.
Hi, I'm here with Scott and Roy, and I'm going to be asking them about how they feel about bed sharing with an infant. So basically, we'll just be asking your opinion on whether or not you would agree with parents sleeping with an infant under 3 to 6 months old. So do you think it's safe? What's your opinion and perspective on it?
I mean, I can see why they would want to, but I feel like it wouldn't be as safe as having them in a cradle or something, maybe right next to the bed, just for the purpose of rolling over or something. You never know what you do in the middle of the night. God forbid you fall asleep and roll over on top of the child and end up suffocating or something. So I don't see it as being a really safe option.
I couldn't agree more.
So what age would you consider co-sleeping to be a good idea at?
I mean, I'm not really sure, because I've never really had much experience with babies, but I know they are durable. So maybe, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, 2 years or so, where they're more sufficient at breathing by themselves. And
This is Deandra Jagan, and I'll be asking him about his opinion on co-sleeping with an infant. And basically what that means is whether or not you believe that a parent should sleep with an infant underneath the age of 3 to 6 months. So what do you think about it?
While I definitely understand the concerns that come with bed sharing, my parents, I slept in the same bed with them when I was a baby. They did the same thing with my siblings, so and nothing bad happened, so it can't be all that bad.
So what do you believe are the pros and cons of it?
A pro would probably just be that security and just maintaining that consistent connection between the parent and child. Even when they sleep, they get that sense of protection and like their parents are there, as opposed to like putting them in a crib where it's like they sleep by themselves, they're lonely. The con would just be them, possibly, rolling over on the child, not even suffocating per se, just like causing some kind of accidental injury to them, God forbid you move a certain way.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alright. I'm sitting here with Brooke today, and we're going to be discussing her thoughts on co-sleeping mother and infant. So, Brooke, how do you feel? What's your stance on co-sleeping with your baby?
I understand that it's like a little dangerous, but I was I was a light sleeper when I first had her, so I didn't really, I first started sleeping with her when she was like a month old, and then because she would just sleep better, and I'm like so tired, I was just like, I can't do it. So I always made sure there was like certain things around her that like couldn't suffocate her or anything like that, and I would just stay like away from her. And so I don't have any problem with it, and I think if it's your kid, you can do whatever you want.
Agreed. So what do you think is like the biggest pro of sleeping with your infant?
I don't really think there's like a huge pro like from the baby's perspective. Like I know like they'll be more attached to you and they'll feel like close, and I think I read somewhere that sometimes they're just more I don't know how to explain it, like not attached, but
A bond.
yeah, like a bond with you and like close. And
Say hi to the camera.
say hi. Okay. And but like for me, I just felt so close to her, and like I feel like I can protect her more if she's with me instead of in another room and stuff. So that's like really a big thing for me.